There's a version of Trafalgar Law that gets repeated in nearly every YouTube video, every tier list, every coolest One Piece character's video. The cool and intimidating anti-hero with a dark backstory. That version isn't wrong exactly. It's just incomplete in the way a diagnosis is incomplete without the prognosis. Law's cold, yes. Law's precise, yes. But coldness and precision are not where you start explaining him. They're where you end up, after you understand what he actually is. Which is something almost no other major character in this story gets to be. A person who was handed a second life by someone who paid for it with his own, and who has spent every year since trying to work out what that life is actually for. Before anything else happened to Trafalgar Law, he was told he was going to die. Law's childhood catastrophe began with amber-lead syndrome, which is not an accident or a piece of bad luck arriving from outside. It is a countdown. The white spots spread, the timeline is known, the outcome is fixed, and the child carrying it can do arithmetic. Law was a doctor's son in a country of doctors. He understood the prognosis better than most adults, and no version of it ended with him alive at 14. Law's defining trait is not his intelligence, his coldness, or his trauma. It is the psychology of a person handed a second life he never expected to need, by someone who paid for it with his own, and who has spent every year since negotiating what such a life is supposed to be used for. The specific load-bearing question of, what do you do with a life someone else died to give you? That is the only question Law has ever actually been working on, and he has answered it 3 different ways in 3 different decades. Flevance, the White City, built its entire wealth on amber lead, a mineral beautiful enough to be mistaken for something worth having, and toxic enough over sustained exposure to kill the people who mined and processed it across generations. The world government knew, Flevance's own royal authority knew, and the information didn't reach the people whose bodies were absorbing it, because an entire economy depended on that silence. But the thing is, Law's parents were doctors. His father was already training him in medicine as a small child, dissection, anatomy, the discipline of understanding a body completely, because that was the family vocation, the family inheritance, the thing they were raising him to become. And they didn't know, not the full truth of what was accumulating in their patient's blood and their son's blood, until the disease had already progressed past the point where knowing helped anyone. Think about what that means structurally. Law was being raised inside the highest ideal of medical care, by people whose entire life's purpose was protecting bodies from harm, inside a country whose prosperity was quietly, deliberately built on poisoning those exact same bodies. The people supposed to protect him were kept in the dark by the very systems of authority his parents represented and trusted. And that is the specific seed to his character. Everything Law becomes, the obsession with precision, the total command over anatomy, the specific brand of surgeon of death irony where healing and killing run through the same hands, starts here. In a household where medicine was both a devotion and, unknowingly, a lie the world was telling itself. When the symptoms became visible and undeniable, neighboring nations, believing that the disease was contagious, quarantined Flevance. When its people tried to flee the burning, dying country, they were slaughtered under the banner of self-defense and containment. The royal family fled and abandoned their own citizens. The world government did nothing to stop any of it. Law's younger sister Lami died in the fire that took the hospital where she was being treated. And Law himself survived by hiding among a mountain of corpses being wheeled out on carts, small enough and still enough to pass for one more body among the dead. Everything I just mentioned is the physical foundation for everything that follows. As I said earlier, Law's survival was purchased through his specific proximity to death. Literally, his continued existence depended on being close enough to corpses that no one looked twice. That is going to define, for the rest of his life, how death and survival relate to each other in his head. Rather than life and death being opposite sides of a coin, they were adjacent conditions for Law, sometimes even indistinguishable. Flevance was killed twice, once by a lie of omission that manufactured the disease, once by a lie of misapprehension that made the massacre look justified to the people carrying it out. Every layer of protective authority that a child is supposed to be able to trust. His own country's nobility, the world government's oversight, the neighboring nation's claim of legitimate self-defense. They all failed him, or actively participated in his family's death. Law's later total distrust of institutional structures is the empirically correct conclusion of a child who watched every single one of those structures either abandon him or try to kill him. After Flevance, Law, sick, alone, carrying a countdown in his own blood, joined the Don Quixote pirates wearing a belt of grenades, stating openly that he intended to die taking as many people down with him as possible. This immediately reads as juvenile edge, the standard tragic orphan rage that a story deploys so the mentor has something to fix. But I personally would like to push back on that reading. In this moment, Law has a fixed and short time horizon, no surviving dependents, no institution that will act on his behalf. and a demonstrated understanding that the world is run by parties who will lie about a poison to protect a market. Under those conditions, maximize damage before termination is not irrational. It is the rational play for a person whose only remaining resource is his own body, and whose only remaining preference is that the outcome not be one-sided. It is horrifying, and it is coherent. There was no hope in the picture for him, nothing at all. Hope is a bet that tomorrow is worth investing energy into today. Law had extensive, direct physical evidence that tomorrow was a lie the world tells you right up until the moment it kills you. He'd been diagnosed with a terminal illness as a small child. He'd then watched everyone he loved die faster and more violently than the disease itself would have managed. What exactly is the emotional infrastructure that's supposed to survive that and still produce hope? Joining the most violent pirate crew available and planning to spend his remaining time maximizing damage isn't a moral failure on Law's part. Given his evidence, it's the last coherent plan left on the table. If nothing is real except pain and its infliction, at least infliction is something you can still do. And this is exactly what Doflamingo recognized and exploited. Doflamingo didn't instill Law's nihilism. He just understood, instantly and correctly, what it was worth. A child with nothing left to lose and a genuine appetite for destruction is close to the ideal weapon, because he can't be threatened, can't be bargained with, can't be controlled through the promise of a future he doesn't believe exists. Doflamingo's welcome of Law into the family wasn't compassion. It was recruitment. The identification of exactly the kind of broken instrument his whole organization was built to cultivate and use, which is why Corazon's presence inside that same organization, and his specific decision to look at Law and see something other than a weapon, is where the page starts to turn. Don Quixote Rocinante was introduced to Law, and to us, as Doflamingo's clumsy, mute, apparently useless younger brother, a man who claimed to hate children and once threw Law out of a window. Law's response to that hostility was to stab him. Corazon didn't retaliate and didn't report it. He lied to Doflamingo about an outside attacker. But the thing that was happening underneath that performance was something else entirely. Corazon was a Marine commander, operating undercover inside his own brother's criminal empire at extraordinary personal risk for the purpose of destroying it from within. Every apparent flaw, the muteness, the clumsiness, the professed hostility toward children, was camouflage. The one person in that entire organization who was secretly working hardest to save his life presented himself as the person least interested in doing so. Law believed he was surrounded exclusively by users and monsters, while the man trying to give him a future stood directly in front of him, in disguise as someone who didn't care. When Corazon discovered Law was dying of amber-lead syndrome, his entire mission changed shape. He started dragging Law from hospital to hospital searching for treatment, eventually learning of a devil fruit rumored to cure any ailment, the Ope Ope no Mi, and resolved to steal it specifically to save this one child's life. I think this is worth naming plainly as the found family theme running underneath much of this series, expressed in one of its most extreme forms. A man with zero biological obligation to this boy, already risking his life on an active undercover mission, chose to layer an entirely new, enormously dangerous objective on top of everything else he was doing. Steal the fruit, force-feed it to a boy who didn't trust him, save him, for no reason except that he'd come to see something in Law worth saving. At some point before the end, Law told Corazon his full name, Trafalgar D. Waterlaw, and the D shocked Corazon, because it meant Law carried the will of D, a detail he was never supposed to say out loud to anyone. I think this is the single moment of total, voluntary trust in the entire flashback. Law hands over the most dangerous piece of information about himself, the fact that structurally marks him as an enemy of the world government regardless of anything he ever chooses to do, to the one person who had earned it without ever demanding it. Doflamingo discovered the betrayal. Law was forced to eat the fruit to save himself. And in the final act of his mission, Corazon hid Law inside a toy chest so the boy could escape while he faced his brother alone, dying at Doflamingo's hands, having spent the last year of his life orchestrating, at enormous risk and ultimate cost, the survival of a child who was never his responsibility. Now take note of the shape of that final act. Protection built from concealment. That's the exact pattern of everything Corazon ever did for Law. Hide the care inside something that looks like its opposite. It's the same language, expressed one more time, at the literal highest possible cost. This debt cannot be repaid, simply due to the fact that the man who gave it is now dead. Corazon's gift to Law has no reciprocal channel. It ended the moment it was completed, which produces something unusual. Law doesn't carry a favor he can discharge with a gesture. What Law carries is life, and the only conceivable form of repayment is making that life mean something. And that, more than anything, is the engine underneath everything Law does for the next 15 plus years of story time. The Ope Ope no Mi lets Law create a room in which he can manipulate anything with surgical precision, swap organs, remove hearts without killing, separate consciousness from body, and, crucially, cure amber lead syndrome, which he eventually did, curing himself and ending the last known case of the disease in the world. Corazon explicitly chose it for a stated medical reason, for a boy from a family of doctors, in a world where the fruit was already famous as the ultimate medical power, understanding exactly what Law had been raised to become before the world took it from him. This fruit is the one object in the entire series that most precisely reunites Law with the vocation his parents were building him toward before everything burned. The surgeon of death becomes ironic here, because he's expressing both halves of what was done to him simultaneously, the healer his parents made him, and the killer the world's cruelty also made him. Running through the exact same hands, the exact same training in anatomy his father gave him as a child. And the fruit's one absolute limit carries its own weight here. It can grant eternal youth or extend a life, but only by permanently transferring the user's own life to someone else. The power that saved Law, that Corazon died to give him, is also the power that makes Law a permanent target for anyone in the world chasing immortality. So even after the gift, Law's existence remains something the world wants to extract from. The specific shape of the danger changed, from a toxic mineral to a body other people want to harvest. But the underlying condition, being valued only for what can be taken out of him, never actually went away. Now Law didn't go after Doflamingo the moment he had the strength to try. He spent years building the Heart Pirates, cultivating a reputation, eventually accepting a warlord title specifically to buy the political cover and resources needed to eventually move against Doflamingo on his own terms. I think this patience is the clearest single piece of evidence that Corazon's gift actually worked. The child who wore grenades and wanted to die taking people with him had no plan beyond immediate obliteration. There was no future to plan around. The adult who spends 13 years quietly assembling exactly the tools needed for one specific, targeted act of justice is operating from a completely different relationship to time. He has decided his remaining life is valuable enough to spend deliberately, rather than burn all at once. And that's Law becoming someone capable of investing in a future he once had every reason to believe didn't exist. And the warlord title itself is worth pausing on, because it's a genuine contradiction here. Accepting that title means operating nominally inside the same world government apparatus, whose negligence and cruelty destroyed Flevance in the first place. Law is willing to wear the enemy's colors, temporarily, strategically, if it gets him measurably closer to the one act of justice he's spent over a decade building toward. That tells you something essential about how his moral compass is actually wired, and it's different from Luffy's. Luffy's compass is organized around consistency of principle. He won't compromise it regardless of the tactical cost. Law's compass is organized around a specific, immovable debt to a specific dead man. Everything else, alliances, titles, appearances, is negotiable in service of that one fixed point. What he built during that time was the Heart Pirates, present in every arc, but rarely ever spotlighted. But look at the scale of what he built and what he lost. Flevance was an entire country, an entire inherited community, destroyed in a single catastrophic act of the world's indifference that Law, as a child, had zero power to resist. The Heart Pirates are the second community he builds, deliberately smaller, deliberately more contained, organized around his own leadership instead of an inherited structure he never chose. A deliberate response to having watched something enormous get destroyed by forces he couldn't fight as a kid. As an adult, with actual power, Law builds only what he now believes he can defend, his crew following him with a quiet, largely uncommented devotion. That's Corazon's model of care, inherited whole. Corazon hid his kindness inside apparent coldness and uselessness. Law expresses his care through competence and protection rather than declaration, because that's the only language of love anyone actually modeled for him. When Law eventually runs into Luffy at Punk Hazard, Law approaches Luffy exactly the way he approaches everything post-Corazon, as an instrument toward one specific end, which is Doflamingo's destruction. He doesn't particularly trust or like Luffy at first. What changes him isn't one dramatic scene. It's repeated exposure to a form of loyalty that operates on completely different logic than his own 13-year calculation. Luffy commits to people uncalculated, immediately, without waiting to see if it's strategically justified. Now we see the cultivation of everything in Wano. This is where we see the clearest evidence of expansion of his worldview. Law becomes entangled in the Kozuki family's fight to reclaim their country from Kaido. This has nothing to do with him. It's not his tragedy, not his debt, but a cause he chooses to support anyway. This is significant simply because it cost him nothing structurally required by his own history. A man who spent over a decade acting almost exclusively inside the frame of his own specific grievance extends his loyalty and skill towards someone else's fight, with no equivalent debt compelling him. That's exactly the kind of expansion Corazon's gift was always quietly aimed at producing, even if Corazon never lived to see whether it would happen. A person capable of caring about something beyond his own survival and his own particular wound. Luffy's D is announced. It is in his name from the first chapter. It gets said out loud by everyone from Garp to Whitebeard, and it functions as a badge, a marker of the lineage of people who make the world's rulers nervous. Law's D was something he was told to hide. That is the entire difference, and it changes what the initial does to a person. Corazon's warning was a security briefing. The clan of D are called the natural enemy of God. To a boy already dying, already hunted, already the last of a town, the message is that his own surname is a second diagnosis with its own kill radius. Law is the only major D. We have watched deliberately investigate his own name as a research question, from a position of not knowing, with an explicitly stated intention to find out. Luffy carries the will without examining it. Blackbeard treats it as raw material. Law has set himself the same problem, and approached it as a scholar, which is exactly what a doctor's son from a country killed by suppressed information would do. As of now, Law's heart pirates are defeated by another major D of the story, which makes Chapter 1081 the cruelest possible test of his character. Blackbeard's crew ambushes the heart pirates for Law's road poneglyph rubbings. Law is defeated. The polar tang is cut in half. The crew is scattered in the water. Beppo, who forced himself into Sulong form, grabs Law and hauls him into the sea. Law protests. Law demands they go back for the others. Beppo refuses and says he has faith the rest will survive. Everything Law has built post-Corazon has been taken away by a force he could not outplan. His survival was, again, purchased by somebody else's sacrifice, an act he did not authorize, could not prevent. Corazon put him in a box so he could not participate in his own rescue. Beppo carried him into the water over his explicit refusal. Same structure but 20 years apart. The man who spent his entire adult life engineering a situation in which nobody would ever have to do that for him again, ended up in the water, alive, on someone else's decision. But Law's whole arc has never been about invincibility. It's been about what a life that keeps almost running out gets used for. Losing to Blackbeard, having his crew scattered, and being physically saved by the same devotion that traces back to Corazon is the story reminding us that the second life Law was given was never a guarantee of safety. It was only ever a chance to keep choosing what life is for, fight after fight. At the end of the day, Law was given a life he never expected to need, by a man who paid for it with his own, inside a world that had already proven, twice, exactly how little it valued people like him. The question that structures his entire character is simple to state and impossible to finish. What do you do with a life someone else died to give you? He spent his first years unable to answer it at all, planning only to spend his remaining time causing damage. He spent the next 13 answering it narrowly, with precision, with patience, aimed at one target and one debt. And in the time since Dressrosa, through Wano, through the loss, he's been answering it more broadly than he ever expected to, extending loyalty to causes that aren't his own tragedy, building something resembling family with the Heart Pirates, standing with people because he's come to trust them rather than because he owes them anything. Law has never been defined by his tragedy, his coldness, or even his intelligence. He's defined by the ongoing, unfinished project of proving Corazon's sacrifice wasn't wasted, that a life bought at that price can eventually become something worth having been bought. The transition from receiving to giving, from being the person other people's sacrifices keep alive to being the person who decides, freely and in full knowledge, what his own life is spent on. He hasn't finished proving it, and that's exactly where the story is taking him, toward the moment where he finally gets to decide, on terms that are entirely his own and owed to no one, that life is worth keeping, because he's built something with it that he'd choose to protect.